So welcome to this live conversation on living systems as part of the ETH DRRS program. Welcoming Daniel Christian Wahl and Johannes Yogi Jäger. Yogi, who are you? What are you doing in a nutshell?
I used to be a proper experimental biologist, studying the evolution of different species of flies. And then I turned into not really a philosopher, but someone who looks at biological problems more philosophically. So my current work is concerned with the difference between living and non-living systems, for example, organisms versus AI algorithms. And I'm trying to study how the concepts that we're using to characterize the differences between those are used. And that's very important to properly understand those systems.
Well, Yogi and I share common mentors, and at least in 1 year of our life journeys, we share a common past because Yogi was, I think, in the 2nd year of the Masters in Holistic Science at Schumacher College, and I was in the 5th year when the program was still very young. And the Masters in Holistic Science is a master's that really tried to explore the systemic views in science from complexity theory, chaos theory, Goethean approach, like the qualitative science of qualities, Gaia theory, which later turned into Earth system science, like the whole systems dynamics of the planet, and also a kind of second order science that paid attention to the role of the observer and worldview and value systems and how we do science, paying attention again to the dimension of mind in science. And so that's where Yogi and I met. And I think for both of us, it has marked how we worked since then. And that's 20 years ago.
Yeah, that fits really well to our current massive open online course and also certificate of advanced studies entitled Beyond Systems Thinking. And they want to look a bit into living systems and what they are and what we can learn being part of a living system and what that meaning has to us to designing for resilient and regenerative systems. As an entry topic, Yogi, what are living systems? How can we describe them?
So it's a funny topic because it's really difficult to pin down. And actually, most biologists who study life in a lab today, they think of organisms as some very sophisticated machine. But organisms are very different from machines. And one of the main differences is that they build themselves. They're self-manufacturing systems. This is called autopoiesis, self-making in Greek. And it's something that no technology that we have built so far can actually do. And what it means is that an organism can not only produce all the components that it needs for its continued existence, but it also can assemble them in a way that brings forth its own organization. So it's sort of a self-perpetuating system. At the same time, it's very fragile because it has to do work, physical work, to persist, to stay alive. So we have to constantly regenerate ourselves as organisms. And this is not how a rock persists, for example. A rock is just there. And it stays what it is. Okay? So these modes of living in an organism and of existence in a non-living system is one of the big differences between the two. And what that means, if you can self-manufacture, if you basically build yourself, is that you suddenly have meaning. You are in an environment, and because you are producing yourself constantly and have to regenerate yourself constantly, and you need energy to do that, there are things in your environment that are good for you, there are opportunities for you to persist, and there are things that are bad for you. There are obstacles that make it difficult for you to persist. And so your environment is suddenly full of meaning and value, because you are this fragile self-manufacturing system. While if you're a machine, if your AI algorithm that you're programming is waiting for your input, it doesn't get impatient, it doesn't get bored. It is just there. There's no activity. And you cannot just do nothing. You constantly have to sort of rebuild yourself to keep on existing. And what that gives us is three major differences between living systems and non-living systems. So one is the difference in organization that I just mentioned, that we are autopoietic, we are self-manufacturing, but non-living systems are not. The other one is that we are not constructed. If you build a machine, you build the parts, they exist before the machine exists, and you put them together. And then the machine is sort of the sum of the function and the interaction of those parts. While a living system, of course, evolves and grows out of itself. It constructs itself at both the level of evolution and development. And the last thing is that this means that organisms live in what is called a large world. If things have meaning around you, you need to find out first what is relevant to you out of this environment in which there are lots of different factors. What is meaningful? And of course, a machine like a AI algorithm, again, cannot do this because it lives in a world where everything is just there. It is either everything is relevant or nothing is relevant in that world. That's called a small world. So a large and a small world, the difference is not the size of the world. Actually, small worlds can also be endlessly large in size, but it is the fact that in a large world, many of the problems that you encounter, the things that are important for you, are not well defined. So you need to, before you can actually solve a problem, go and define the problem. This is called the problem of relevance, or the frame problem in AI research. And it is a big problem for AI researchers because algorithms not only cannot solve this problem, but they never even encounter it because of what I just said before. So there's a fundamental difference between living and non-living systems, which doesn't mean that living systems are somehow miraculous. The difference is just in the organization. So we consist of exactly the same matter. We consume exactly the same energy as non-living systems do. But the way we are organized, the way that the processes that make up our bodies are interacting and maintaining themselves is what makes us different, and what makes us behave differently, what makes us be able to experience the world. I would say those are the most important differences.
It's interesting, Yogi, that it might help to just, because too many people hear the word life and equate it with the word nature. And to just sort of highlight the distinction there, that like Goethe saying, he who doesn't see nature everywhere sees her nowhere in the right light, is a reminder that we are all using the same elements and the same energy, whether it's a robot or a living being. But that doesn't mean that a robot is a living being, because I think that a lot of people somehow get confused and want to give the ability of life to everything. And but then the question is, where does that leave us with panpsychism and worldviews that do prescribe life to everything? I think it's increasingly important to make this distinction between the living and the non-living. Otherwise, we muddle the water of technological evolution and human evolution, or living evolution in a way that will be confusing and possibly catastrophic. What's your thought on that?
Let me put it this way. So the importance of a concept is in its use, right? So it always depends a bit whether the concept is useful for answering a question that you have. And I think it's pretty fundamental that living systems are different from non-living systems. So somebody once said that living systems are those that kick back when you kick them. And this may be a bit of a joke, but it's true. So they definitely work in ways that you wouldn't expect. So unexpected behavior is one of the abilities that a living system has that a non-living system doesn't have. And so if you treat everything the same, you very likely at this time in our human history end up treating everything like a machine, whether it's living or non-living. And this is the big problem, because the way you actually treat living systems should be very different, because they are self-manufacturing, they take care of themselves. And instead of, when your car is broken, you bring it to the mechanic, because your car is a machine, it needs constant maintenance to be working properly. While the plants in your garden, they don't need that. What you do is you water them, you give them soil, and then they build themselves. So the treatment of living versus non-living systems should be very different. We should take a gardening approach to living systems where we give them the conditions to thrive, to build themselves, rather than treating them like machines like we do in industrial agriculture and in many other ways. We treat the entire world as a machine. So I think this difference is morally important. But for me personally, in my work, it is important because we need a completely different science for machines and for living beings, because the kind of mathematics we have, the kind of experiments we have, they're all built on the idea that everything is a mechanism. And so when we do that, we throw out what is actually meaningful. For example, if you think about the functioning of a brain, people say, oh, the brain is a computer because it can compute. But that's actually where the theory of computation comes from. A computer in the original papers about computation was a person who did some automatic calculations by rote. It wasn't a machine. So it's no wonder that the brain can calculate. But that's not the point of the brain. That's not what it evolved for. And the brain can also judge. Judgment. What is good for me? What is bad for me? And as Joseph Weizenbaum already pointed out in the 1970s, this is fundamentally different from computing the solution of a problem. Judgment and computation are fundamentally different. And judgment is something that only organisms can do, because only organisms have to survive and maintain themselves and keep themselves alive.
Going in the same direction to understand a bit more where some boundaries are here. So living systems, we humans are living systems. We are made of cells. What about our direct environment? We interact with the atmosphere. We have a climate that's changing. We are part of human cultures. Are these all living systems or part of living systems, or do we have a clear boundary somewhere here?
So one of the key features of a living system is that it can act. So it can basically originate action from within its own organization because it is building itself. Consequences can arise from within the organism that we call action or behavior. While rocks, dead things, they just passively react to their environment, organisms can act in an anticipatory manner. They can plan, they can do things deliberatively. But we have to make an important distinction. While we sit around here and think about our place in the world and about ourselves, a bacterium will not do that. A plant will not do that. What those simpler organisms do is related to what we can do, but it doesn't work through intentions or what we call cognition, the functioning of our nervous system. They don't have a nervous system, but they still have agency. They have things in their environment that are good for them and bad for them. Think about a bacterium swimming in the direction of a sugar gradient, avoiding a toxin. It does not contemplate what it's doing, but it has evolved to make the distinction between the good sugar and the bad toxin. So it can make judgments, but it doesn't mean that it's contemplating. It doesn't mean that it has cognition. I think this is important because we also want to understand how during evolution, things like human cognition and consciousness have evolved, have emerged from much simpler organisms. And the mistake of panpsychism is to throw those questions out, basically saying there is no mystery. Everything has subjectivity. Everything has the capability to be intelligent or to think in some manner. And we, as living systems, are just accumulations of such proto-thinking molecules. I think this just is a non-explanation. It doesn't answer the question. It declares the question a non-question. And I think good concepts allow you to answer the questions that you have instead of making those questions illegal. This is why I prefer the idea that phenomena like agency, cognition, and consciousness have evolved, have emerged during evolution, and they're unique to living systems. They do not happen in the beautiful mountain in your background, Tobias. It is not thinking. It is just there, and it reacts to its environment passively.
The use of the word anticipation here, though, I think is something that comes in when you do have cognition and a concept of past, present, and future, and all of that. So I think that anticipation is something that might be mainly a human character and characteristic, and particularly in a worldview of humanity as nature, as an expression of the nested, transforming, evolving wholeness that is a living planet, to use that metaphor that also has a bit of a question to it. Yeah, I'm losing my thread here. Where was it going?
So maybe we can go to higher levels, ecological levels, and think what is happening there. So we already went to the bacterium and said, okay, it's not really thinking. It can anticipate only in the sense that it has some sort of responses and actions, a repertoire of actions that have evolved for it to decide. You see, we don't have enough the vocabulary to talk about this. It doesn't really decide by thinking about anything, but it selects between different behaviors that cause it to move towards the sugar and avoid the toxin. Okay, then we have human beings that can make intentional anticipatory plans and actions that are deliberative in a sense that it is explicit, it's conscious. We think about our actions, we think about our thoughts, and we get stuck as the only species, I think, on the planet that can get stuck in their own thoughts. Let's move on then to even higher level systems. Ecosystems, societies, economies are agential systems. They're not directly like organisms because they don't have the same coherence. They don't have exactly the same organization as an organism. They don't reproduce themselves in a way an organism does. But they have similar coherence, and they have the unpredictability of a living system because they consist of living systems. So it's completely absurd to think that we can model an economy. If we model the financial market, that moment we have a model of the financial market will change because everybody in the financial market will now have that model and will behave differently. And this is a way in which a system that is not an organism, an economy, a financial market can anticipate as well. So it can have expectations, it can have behavior that are based on predictions while not being a living system. So all living systems are anticipatory in this sense, but not all anticipatory systems are living systems. And so we like to talk about higher level coherence, Gaia theory, the planet as an organism. I find this metaphor of the superorganism slightly problematic because let's look at human society at the moment. What is the problem? Why are we in the meta crisis? Why do we have all these ecological, political, social emergencies right now? It is exactly because we are lacking coherence at the societal level. We are fragmented. And so we do not have autopoiesis at a higher level. And we probably never will have, and we also don't need our society to be like a superorganism. That is scary. It reminds me of the Borg in Star Trek and a sort of a collective intelligence. Instead, we want to keep our individual freedoms, but we want to have a sort of a coherence. And I think in your work, you describe this very nicely by using concepts just such as panarchy and these adaptive cycles. So here we have innovative individuals in an organization, in a society that disrupt, that innovate, that change things, while you have a stable layer on top that is coherent and remembers experiences of the past. But if this coherence is broken, like it is in today's society, then you have a problem and you lack coordination and things get out of hand. So it's really important to study why, again, ecosystems, why the biosphere is not exactly like an organism. They're different. And I think these differences matter. This is why I'm skeptical about calling the whole planet a superorganism.
Well, I mean,
because I think, Yeah, we need the right metaphors, the right concepts to understand precisely what is the same and what is different between the different levels and how they work together.
I mean, in the German speaking world, it hasn't really made the rounds so much internationally, but the work of Nicholas Luhmann has kind of robbed the word autopoiesis from Maturana and Varela and applied it to social systems. And I don't think Maturana and Varela would have ever, well, Maturana doesn't agree with that. And I also remember another young Chilean that was on the Masters in Holistic Science when I was studying, was trying to work with Jim Lovelock about autopoiesis at the planetary scale. And Jim was saying, no, we don't have autopoiesis at the planetary scale. We have a organization that is made up of living systems working in concert to change the conditions of the larger system, but the larger system isn't autopoietic, like the planet in itself. And that's basically what you're highlighting, that in that distinction, yes, the life is a planetary process, but that doesn't mean the planet is alive.
There are regulatory planetary processes, as we will find out, or we are finding out right now. But they are not the same, as you say. So I think it's very important to make these distinctions so we can clearly understand how different levels of organization work together. Because this is another aspect of living systems, that you can get order from a very quick disordered exchange of components. Think of a stable ecosystem can still have, the species are changing very quickly underneath. The individuals come and go even more quickly. But my colleague Fort Doolittle calls this the singers change, but the song remains the same, is his approach to what he calls ecological persistence. And that's important because it is exactly not like organisms that pass their organization on from generation to generation. It can maintain that organization even in the absence of any stability at the lower level. And we wouldn't recognize this if we said, oh, everything is just like an organism, everything is harmonious and coherent. Another danger is, again, to seek for harmony all the time, while regeneration implies decay. And that's another beautiful aspect of your work that I just read, that you need cycles, and those cycles include decay and reorganization. Without a rearrangement, structural organizational rearrangement, there is no adaptation, there is no innovation.
That's fascinating, because I have there's a lot of conversation at the moment where people get so fascinated with collapse. And they're almost, it's creating another othering culture in the world of social media, where if you're not leading with collapse as, don't you see we need collapse awareness, then you're mistaken and you're misleading people. But if you understand the dynamism of life itself, then the very fact that structures that no longer serve and are not fit for purpose any longer are crumbling around us is actually a sign of hope, because the living system is in that phase of the adaptive cycle, or the adaptive wave, depending on how you want to put it, of breakdown of structures that no longer serve. It is moving towards the edge of chaos, which Stuart Kaufman reminds is where living systems, precisely because some of the rigidity has broken down, can become more creative again.
Exactly. So this is the difference, of course, in your frameworks between conservation and regeneration, which one thing is to preserve and to have this image, which is very romantic, but also a little old-fashioned, about the harmony of nature. Nature can be very unharmonious and cruel at times. And we need to recognize that, and the beauty in decay, because out of the ashes arise new phoenixes. And this is something that if you prevent that, you kill a living system. And if you don't understand what the basic difference is between a living system and a non-living system, then you misunderstand exactly this point. Because even an individual living system needs to constantly regenerate itself. I'm not talking about regrowing your limb if you lose a limb. I'm talking about the fact that no cell in your body is the same than it was 10 years ago. You are not the same person. And this has brought a lot of grief to a lot of people who are looking for the self as a thing. But the basic insight is that you're constantly regenerating. And this is exactly what it means to be alive. Now, if you have this sort of view of a living system, you have a completely different approach. You understand immediately that you cannot control and predict living systems like you can engineered systems. So what you need to do is you need to adapt to a situation yourself as a living system in which you cannot perfectly predict what's going to happen next. And you need to slow down. You need to find out what are the leverage points in the system. You need to carefully nudge them. And then you need to monitor what happens carefully and slowly, rather than moving fast and breaking things. Like this was the Facebook motto, I think, in its early days, which is a very dangerous thing to do in a system that depends so much on multi-level coherence, that is so unpredictable. So these are all insights that the people who are dreaming of technological solutions to everything right now, they don't have that. So it's really, really important that we move radically away from the idea that the world is a machine to the idea that, not the idea that the world is an organism either. The world is the world. It's not a machine, it's not an organism, but it has much more features that are organismic, that are agential, than we would like to admit, with our worldview, which is firmly based on the idea that everything is a mechanism. This only gets us so far.
So if we recap a bit some of the features of the smallest units of life, cells, nonlinearity, emergence, antifragility. If we think about higher levels of organization, Daniel, and going into the kind of one of the focal governance scales of designing resilient systems, the bioregional scale. We have this framework of the cross-scale spiral with different circularities on each of the governance scales, from green chemistry to materials to buildings to cities and the services to landscapes to bioregions and transnational relations. So what are some examples what we can learn and transfer from better understanding living systems, units of life for higher levels of organization? You're muted.
I think the core proposition here is that a large part of what we are currently framing as the polycrisis or the meta crisis, which is also a framing through problems rather than the potential that evolving systems have. It's again that's way of seeing that can quickly put us into abstraction and not into the specific, but a lot of them have to do with the fact that human technological and socio-political systems have believed for so long in this metaphor of the machine, have favored for so long what is measurable and quantifiable, that we're not paying attention how this narrative that we've created through a particular way of seeing and the world that we've built on the basis of that is no longer fitting with the patterns in which life creates conditions conducive to life. It's out of scale, it's out of pace, it's out of proportion. And the challenge is to refit, as David Orr, one of my mentors that I also met at Schumacher College, said, the design challenge of the 21st century is to fit a species arrogant enough to call itself Homo sapiens onto a planet with a biosphere. I think that's very well put. And my sense is that the scale of bioregion is the biogeophysical scale of a real lived context in which we can handle the complexity of living system and technological systems interacting within context. And as Yogi was saying earlier, we can dance with the system and the feedback is short enough because we're at a scale where we can observe the effects of our actions more closely. And so, and if you look at these scales that we're working with in this scalar governance spiral, all of them apart from the last one are within the context of the bioregion. And how would we begin to do material science, architecture, urban planning, industrial design, informed by the living pattern of a specific ecosystem and the specific conditions of a watershed, of a bioregion, of an ecosystem, of which we ultimately are expressions and not owners. And we need to be humble participants in this nested complexity that will always, as Yogi said, surprise us because it's made up of living systems and they're surprising. And so the big experiment has been, can we, through abstraction and globalization and generalization, solve all these problems? And clearly we've made them worse. So the proposition now is to say, actually, we can spend the time we've got left as a species on a planet that we've put on the brink of catastrophic failure, for us at least, can we make that shift and say, how would we fit back in? And for that, I believe this bioregional scale is important, and learning to listen to place and ecosystem and the specificity of both the ecology and the socio-cultural aspects of a particular place will allow us to make that flip from working on problems to working on the potential that happens when life happens. The chaos, the working with emergence, everything that this program is based on, the stopping to try to force the system, but actually learn with the system, as we try to be of healing influence, as we try to affect positive rather than negative emergence in the face of our not knowing and in the face of uncertainty.
I think that the move from control to participation that Daniel was just describing is extremely crucial. And I think there are two ways you can go about this. And I think very important to those two ways is the concept of anti-fragility. I'll explain that in a moment. But one way, and that's the traditional way that complexity science and much of current biology is going, is to say we need a new way to understand complex living systems so that we can then engineer and control them. So we need a different kind of science of the living because we recognize that our old machine-based approaches don't work, but we do the new kind of science still in that old mindset of trying to control and predict everything. Or we can have a science that contextualizes our technology and it refocuses from what we have achieved to the limitations. It refocuses from the behavior of a system to what constrains the behavior of that system. So if you think about it, basically what a living system is less than the sum of its parts, as Terry Deacon likes to say, because the processes that are going on in your body, they could do many more things than they do in your body, but they have to behave in a coordinated way so that you can continue existing. So basically what the organization of your body does is reduce the different kinds of behaviors those processes can engage in radically to lead to this higher level coherence. And by doing that, it basically perpetuates you in a way that allows you to react to completely unexpected circumstances. And it allows you to react in an adaptive way. Why? Because you are built in a way that is fundamentally different from any machine. You are flexible. You are open. And so you are able to learn as a living being. You are able to evolve. So anti-fragility is the difference between a technology that can withstand challenges and survive them, but just stay the same, that's robustness, and a living organism that can learn from a challenge, from a perturbation. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, that's not true for everything, but to a certain degree. And so you can improve either by adapting your behavior and your physiology as an individual being, or by adapting through evolution across generations. This is what anti-fragility is. So you learn from perturbations. And this is what ecological resilience is. And this only works in systems that are radically dynamic, transient, and open, and constantly in this sort of cycle that you were mentioning before of growth, persistence, decay, and reorganization. That is what you need. And what we're doing by trying to engineer all those systems and have this new science of the living and, you know, engineer living systems is we try to avoid that adaptive cycle, which is the core of what biological organization actually is. So this is a mistake. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to be humble and not learn more about the living world so we can dominate it, but to learn more about our own limitations so we can properly participate in what's going on around us.
And just let me just think before we continue, because there's a couple of points that were really, as you were speaking, you keep triggering points and they go because I keep listening. One of them is this framing of shift from control and manipulation and prediction, which is fundamentally negated by moving into the realm of complex dynamic systems of any system with more than 3 interacting variables. Goes all the way back to Poincaré's 3-body problems. That framing we both learned initially from Professor Brian Goodwin. And as you were speaking in terms of living systems being less than the sum of its parts, I've never heard that before, but it's fascinating. I was very strongly reminded of another notion I learned from Brian and I've been working with in my personal life quite a bit, which is, hold on. Which is the notion of enabling constraint. And that in living systems design, it is basically critical to set that reduction of complex of options in such a way that it enables the complex system to exhibit another behavior, that if it wasn't constricted, it wouldn't make that jump. It's first time I'm thinking about it as you were speaking, but I think it's a fascinating notion. That life actually is a reduction of the options that the processes that it is capable of. Yeah, fascinating. And then there was another one, but I lost it.
It's a form of constraint dynamics. This is the work of a physicist called Howard Petit, who called those constraints non-holonomic constraints, which is Greek for not following the rules. And so the idea is that life doesn't contradict any physical laws, but it also is not explained by physical laws, because what's happening underneath, the processes that work underneath, the biochemistry of your cells, and so on and so forth, they're perfectly physically explainable. But how those processes interact are not explained by the laws of physics, but by the history you have, both in evolution and as an individual, as a biological organism. So what makes you are actually constraints, enabling constraints that reorganize the matter that makes up your body. I think this is an extremely powerful pivot that we're making and that physicists have neglected for years. In their frameworks, they always focus on the underlying dynamics, and they think of those constraints as what they call the boundary conditions. So you can call this doing physics in a box. The way you do physics is you take a part of the world and you pretend it's a box. Okay? And so you study what's going on in the box. But basically what the box is becomes invisible, while everything that matters in biology is the box. Well, I wouldn't say it doesn't matter what's going on inside, but what makes a specific organism that organism is the constraints, the box it puts on the processes that it's made of. So we have to have this sort of switch of focus if we want to understand scientifically how organisms work. And this is one of the questions you had, Tobias, for us to prepare this, was how does philosophy come into this? And this is where the philosophy of science is extremely important, because it says, it looks at a scientific practice, and it can look at that practice from outside and say, look, guys, you have come up with a certain, set of concepts and methodologies that make you completely blind to certain things that are happening. And this is one of them. So in this way, you can explain, without breaking any laws of physics, how biology is not just physics, but doesn't break the laws of physics either. There is no miracle there. People always say, how do you then explain above what the particles in your body are doing? But look at my hand, it's moving around in really weird ways here, right? And so what those particles in my hand are doing is dependent on the entire history of who I am, who my ancestors were, who built the house I'm in, who built the laptop it's dependent on the entire history of the universe, basically. And this is what makes me a very peculiar system that is unlike a physical system that can be described without this reference to history.
We had a couple of thoughts here that brings it a bit back to ourselves and our own role as humans, as living systems, but also in the kind of reconnecting with place, with systems, and questioning ourselves. And you mentioned learning about our own limitations and shifting our consciousness. We have one term that we like to use in our DRS program, and that's organic emergence. So roughly short translated as the trust in our own capacities and the systems we are embedded in, spiritual systems, to deal with uncertainties, to enact and react in a way that we were able to deal with it. And this is a kind of analogy that we use to somehow, befriend the unknown, uncertainty, and move a bit from that rigid planning that we often move to when things are getting a bit unclear, uncertain, and we move beyond our comfort zones. So we're playing in the program with these notions of being taken out of our own comfort zones physically first, which spurs and accelerates the mental part, and then having this repetitive experience of returning back safely, and playing with the notion of having this as an analogy, as a tool, as an inner journey to befriend uncertainty as one of the tool sets to learn. And so the idea of a living systems lab, that's something I would still like to think a bit further. If we think about like a place, like in the back of my screen here, on Visa Institute, which is a bit of designed to be a place to prototype in an experimental place with open boundaries to enact living systems. How far can we consciously or philosophically go in terms of including also the cultural constraints? That to me was really complex and complicated and difficult, where we might have a lot of sufficient knowledge on living systems as we discussed, but the difficulties to bring that further in a context where we humans cooperate, where we humans open up to question ourselves, where we are able to move back and at the end change habits and at the end cultures. That to me is a very open question.
I like very much the idea of these living system labs, because you cannot just do armchair philosophy about participation. So the idea to move from control and prediction to participation means you have to participate, obviously. So you have to get out of the classroom, and you have to develop intuitions, and you have to learn how to fail, and you have to learn how to be comfortable with uncertainties. You have to stop pretending that you actually know what you're doing. You have to try different things, but all within this framework that is not. So there is a limit to how far you can go. So it's like the paradox of tolerance. You have to admit that you don't know what's going on, but you also have to criticize those who do think they know what's going on. Okay, so it's like you cannot be tolerant to intolerant people. Okay, so it is one thing to not know what is going on. It's another thing to not criticize other people because you can say that their view is not consistent when they think it is consistent. And I think this is one of the most difficult problems right now, is we're trying to hide from our problems because we know deep down that what we're doing is not consistent with our beliefs and our values and everything. And also that our society is out of alignment in some way. It's decohering in many different ways. And we feel a little helpless about this. So to let go and to be a participant in that process means to both accept. I'm often called a pessimist because I say, look, things are not good. Because this you need to acknowledge. You need to take this on board before you can act accordingly. And then you can also say, but you know, what's going to happen next is going to be different from what I expect it to be. So that gives me a certain comfort. I think some people call this doomer optimism. It'll get worse before it'll get better. But I think it's very important that we move towards a more sustainable society. And this is only possible in a crisis, because we will go on forever if this society isn't in crisis. It's comfortable. It's nice. Most people have a better living standard, better health, better literacy than they used to have. This whole optimist view of the world that it's better than ever before is true. But to just linearly extrapolate and say we'll have forever this energy abundance that we've made ourselves by burning all the fossil fuel on the planet is just completely ridiculous. And this is not politics, it's physics. It's going to stop very soon. So you're either ready for it or not. And you're not a pessimist if you say, this is going to happen, this will happen. But you're only a good optimist if you're saying, this is going to happen, but I think we can adapt, we can live through it. While just to pretend that nothing is going on and to stick with that manipulative, exploitative worldview that we had before, this is what I would call toxic optimism. So we have to sort of sail between complete despair and fatalism and this sort of toxic optimism that is just pretending that everything is all right when we're really heading towards a cliff.
Recent studies I read said that the most successful people, whatever that means in terms of economic success, but also personal health, are the realistic optimists or the optimistic realists in this context.
I like to call myself that, but a lot of people get very depressed in my presence.
I mean, it's fascinating how the world also, at this point in its blindness of the destructive system that is sort of self-maintaining itself to some extent, is putting a high premium on certainty and people claiming they have certainty about things. And in the history of science, it's the people who lead with their own doubt and lead with their own uncertainty that have actually produced major breakthroughs. So basically, the people who really know their shit know that they know very little, and those who only know a little bit pretend they can tell you what to do. And since our political leaders want clarity and solutions now, they listen to the ones that pretend they know what to do. And if somebody says, no, we all don't know what to do and we need to take it slow to go faster, we need to unlearn before we can learn, which is another core principle of our program here. It's not the common worldview, it's not the common premium way of approaching things to say the same with the obsession with scale. How is this going to change the world immediately? And if it doesn't, then you're relevant. Instead of saying, well, maybe the way to change the world is by all of us changing the places we're in and changing the way we relate to those places and to each other. And suddenly the bigger system solves itself, because that's how living systems are structured and do change. So fascinating.
This is nice because this complexity view of uncertainty also gives you a positive notion that you never know whether something that you think is completely inconsequential is actually going to be the thing that's going to change the history of the world. You never know. So you better behave as if it was, you know? And that's another aspect of living with uncertainty that people often don't see. It gives you meaning through this possibility that what you do may not, but it may very well actually matter a lot, even if you don't think it does. And I think that's a very comforting thought, if you can adapt to that thought. And the bottom line is, the crisis will come. The crisis is always a chance, and you're either ready for it or not. And one big task for me as an outsider for any kind of ecological design is to come up with a whole diversity of potential solutions that we have at hand when they are needed in such a situation. So this is one of the ways in which we can adapt to the unexpected, is by being tolerant of a lot of different playful solutions that may not be very competitive right now. As you say, they may not scale, they may not change the world. They will not right now. It's very difficult to affect change in a system that is in a positive feedback loop towards more and more competition and productivity and I don't know what. But if you can survive with that solution in your little niche, then your day will come, because you will outlive the expiration date of that bigger global dynamic that is headed towards self-destruction.
I'm reminded for some reason, as you were speaking, two things came to mind. One was very biblical: the meek shall inherit the earth. And the other one was Gary Snyder speaking out about the concept of re-inhabitation, coming home to the patterns in which life creates conditions conducive to life. And he said that if we want to take this seriously as a species, we need to make our cause the cause of the peasants and the indigenous people of this world who still live in this inhabitory way, and can teach us how to inhabit the planet. Because when you were speaking earlier, that the saying that the life has got better. Yes, I just felt like we need to nuance that. Much of the benefits and much of the luxury of having these conversations is still only available to a small percentage of humanity, and a large percentage of humanity hasn't actually had much of the benefits from this. And where I'm going with all of this is to say that really those people still know how to live in uncertainty, because they've never been out of uncertainty. And in many ways, maybe we should learn more of those ways of how to basically live in the moment, for the moment, being capable as community collectively to ask, and what next? And that's, I think, where our so advanced, so intellectual, so clever Western culture has actually eroded a key anti-fragility or resilience component, which is social cohesion and being within the same narrative. And now I've also remembered something that you triggered earlier that I think was really fascinating, is that as you were describing resilience and anti-fragility, you were describing what Aaron Antonovsky would have called the salutogenic approach to health. And our entire system is built on a pathogenic approach to health, like a problem, fix it, symptoms, fix the symptoms. And as we're now engaging in this, realizing that we've damaged the system we depend upon, if we try to heal it with the pathogenic understanding of health, like a kind of what you were earlier saying, that the conservation, like falling back into an idealized of the old state, rather than say, no, salutogenesis is about learning from where we're at now, incorporating the effects of the perturbations that have battered us, and build increased capacity to move forward despite of it. And that's really, I think, shifting into that salutogenic approach also welcomes micro breakdowns, micro or larger perturbation in your life, because you see them as opportunities to course correct and learn. And I think that's almost prophetic for our species. That's coming up, course correct and learn.
I think that's beautifully said. And to the first point you made, I think I always say there's two groups of people who will suffer most in the coming crisis. Those are the ones who have nothing to spare, the poor people of the planet, who are most affected by the civilizational breakdown. And the other ones are the upper middle class who can't go shopping with the airplane and, you know, to Paris anymore on the weekend. This will be, or, you know, they can't fill their swimming pools with water anymore. This will be devastating for them.
Well, I see this as many beautiful, thought-provoking, also awakening and constructive thoughts to, for all our core learning journeys in general in this program, to study living systems, study ourselves as living systems, and engage in place-based learning, in opening up to unlearn, to slow down, to deaccelerate, to relearn. And it's our invitation, our approach, our trial of building such learning environments, both out there, if it's Daniel, where you've been engaging for many years on the Balearic Islands, Mallorca, us here at the Mount Witsuit, or anybody in their own places and spaces, just looking at ourselves and how we interact as living systems. So thank you very much from Johannes Jäger, Yogi, and Daniel Wahl for this very thought-provoking and inspiring conversation. And it's just the start of so many more readings we can do, and so much literature out there, and so many inspiring people. Thank you so much, and hope to be back soon with more exchanges.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.